Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this focus group. Just before we get started, a couple of things. My name is Sam. I'm just here to monitor the stream and make sure everything goes smoothly. I'm obviously not your presenter. That would be Adam here. I do have a couple of things as well. If you have any questions, please just pop those into chat. I believe we have a few of our Apteco devs actually in the call with us, so you might even get an answer during the presentation. But without further ado, take it away, Adam.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sam. So yes, this is the Orbit Dashboards focus group from soup to nuts. So I won't repeat James's explanation of what that phrase means, but the idea is that we'll go right from the start to the finish of Dashboards journey. My name is Adam Robertson. I'm a senior developer at Apteco, and I've been with the company since 2004. And in fact, on the little video at the beginning of today's session, there were some pictures of me looking very youthful with very dark black hair. The world has been unkind to me over these years. But I've worked on plenty of parts of our software over the years, from FastStats back when it was called Discoverer, through PeopleStage, and for the last few years I've been working heavily in Orbit as well. Today we're going to be looking at Orbit dashboards, as I say. So we will create and edit dashboards. We will explore the data available in a dashboard. We'll create an audience from that dashboard, and we'll also integrate, show how Orbit integrates with the rest of the Apteco Marketing Suite AMS through into, well, hopefully FastStats and PeopleStage if we have time. So before we start, there's a little bit of housekeeping. The session is being recorded. Everyone's mics have been muted, hopefully except for mine. And yeah, as Sam says, we've got feel free to ask questions in the chat or in the conference platform chat if a question comes to you after the session is finished. Sam and potentially some of my other colleagues will be monitoring these. If we have time, we'll try and answer some at the end of the session. If not, we'll make sure that we get back to you. And potentially we'll see if we can collate all the questions from both of the sessions, questions and answers, and make those available after the event as well. And if you do have a question, make sure we can tell who the question has come from so that we can get back to you. Okay, so we're looking at dashboards, and this is just an example of a dashboard. If we were all in the room together, I would probably ask for a show of hands to see who is using Orbit and Orbit dashboards kind of for real. Hopefully, well, all of you will have seen dashboards yesterday when James did a presentation, and throughout the year maybe, but because I can't see a lot of hands going up, I am going to assume that we'll kind of, I'm not going to assume any particular experience with dashboards, so we'll go right from the beginning and all the way through. But before we look at dashboards, I thought it was maybe just worthwhile setting the scene and talking about Orbit in general. So I think Orbit was originally announced in 2016 at an Apteco Live event, a FastStats user group maybe, and then in 2007 in the spring we produced our first version, which supported taking FastStats results into storyboards and then through into Orbit as collections, and that functionality is still available today in Orbit. In 2018, we added some campaign reporting ability that can report on how a PeopleStage campaign is doing and how many communications it sent out and so on. So that's been in there for a couple of years. In 2019, we released an audiences tool, which allows us to identify records, identify people, and then be able to export them to market to them. In a way, the audiences tool is similar to the FastStats selection mechanism. It's a bit more streamlined. It's not quite as powerful, although you can still do powerful things with it. And hopefully we'll get a chance to see very briefly the audience tool at the end of this talk. And then this time last year, we announced the dashboard tool, and then I think it was maybe in February this year that we released the first version, and then we've been building on it and extending it ever since. The last thing I wanted to mention, and this is just because personally this is something I do a lot of work with, and so it's kind of close to my heart, All of, and James mentioned it before, all of the functionality that you see in Orbit is actually kind of powered by a API behind the scenes, which gives programmatic access to FastStats results. And for data scientists, we also have a Python integration that connects between Python and the Orbit API and allows us to get at a lot of the FastStats results available and the results from the Apteco Marketing Suite to be accessed via in a programmatic way, so you can maybe build pipelines and so on. So that's just something else to mention with my kind of, it's almost my developer hat on there. So, okay, what's the challenge for today's talk? Well, as I say, it's to demonstrate the capabilities of Orbit dashboards, and we're going to look at a new data set. So we're going to show how Orbit fits into the wider Apteco Marketing Suite, and maybe we'll learn a little bit about the NHS. Well, why do I say that? Because the data set that we're going to look at is to do with GP practices and GPs and prescriptions. So we have 3 tables in our data set, about 14,000 practices around the UK, 53,000 GPs, kind of family doctors around the UK, and 49 million prescriptions, which is 2 years worth of data up to August this year for a subset, only 2% of the practices that we're looking at. Now, actually, the full data set, if we'd have included prescriptions for all practices, would have been, if I look at my notes, 424 million prescriptions, and we've cut that down a little bit just to make the demo a bit more tractable, but hopefully 49 million is still a decent number of prescriptions to be looking at. So let's dive in. So if I find Orbit, so I'm ready just to log in at the beginning. That's my email address. So if we log in, so we're starting with a kind of a blank sheet of paper. We don't have any dashboards yet, so we're going to go in and create one. And this is still the traditional overview screen rather than the rather exciting one that James showed yesterday. That will be coming. But let's go in and create a dashboard. So to begin with, we have an empty dashboard. We can hit this plus button to start adding items. We'll do that in a second. But if we can see on the right here, we've got 3 tables that we can use to build our dashboard on, which we saw on the PowerPoint slide. So I think let's start by investigating the practices and just try and orient ourselves and work out what's going on. We could also build like a base filter for this dashboard. So in fact, if we browse the data, we can see we could build a filter to maybe only look at practices in a certain region, certain postcodes, practices that only opened in the last few years, things like this. So this is the data that we've got available to us, but actually I'd like to build this dashboard on the whole data for now. So maybe a good place to start is just a number card to look at the number of practices that we have. So if I search for practices, we can get a count of practices. Okay, about 14,000. Well, that's what the slide said, so that's what we should expect. That's good. Maybe we can add another number card. And this this kind of palette of different tiles that we're using here, this is a slightly pre-release version. James showed it yesterday. It looks quite similar to what you might be used to if you're already an Orbit user. But we can get onto some of the newer things that you can do that are coming soon. But let's look maybe at the count of GPs as well. GPs, and I think yes, 53,164. So that meets our expectation. And if we also add, we have a variable here that will tell us the number of patients registered with each practice. So maybe and if we sum all of those up, we will get the total patients and 60 million. Okay, well, actually, I'm just going to move these to be on the left-hand side. Maybe I'll just make them slightly bigger. So that makes that number sort of match a little bit more. So it's maybe slightly surprising that we don't have more patients than that. I think I'd expect that I mean, the UK population is more like, it's closer to 70 million. So maybe we'll see what's going on there a little bit. So let's maybe look at a map to try and work out if there are any gaps in the data. So let's look at a UK map, because this is UK practices. And well, in fact, let's look at our dimension. So a UK map, we have to use a postcode area here. And again, we want to look at the count of practices. So this is our practice map. Let's see what we get. It's a little bit small. Let's make that a bit bigger. So we can see the number of practices distributed around the country, and we'll come to look at that in a sec. But it might also be interesting to see the kind of average number of patients per practice throughout the country too. I wonder if there's some sort of a spread across the country. So we can make another map, maybe use that button to duplicate this tile. So if we look for, again, make sure we're looking at postcode area, but instead of practices here, let's look at the number of patients variable again. And instead of summing them all up, we'll look for the average. So this is kind of a practice size map. Let's see what we get. Okay, and there's some variation throughout the country, but there's not dramatic variation, but actually we can see that there are some parts of Wales there, and Scotland and Northern Ireland where we don't have patient data, or for the number of patients. So that's interesting. Maybe that goes some way to explain why our total number of patients isn't quite as high as we might have expected. Okay, so we're getting on all right with our dashboard. Let's maybe add a few more things. So maybe we could investigate the size of practices a little bit further. Maybe we could use a bar chart. And actually, let's look at we're going to use a banded variable here. So the number of patients broken into different categories, different bands, and still look at the count of practices. This is like a practice size chart. Let's see, that's a little bit small. Let's make that, we can make that a little bit more the correct size. And so here we can see that some practices we don't know the size of, and I guess that matches up with what we saw on the map there. Some practices are a bit smaller, but then lots of practices fall in this kind of 3,000 to 9,000 patient range. So that's interesting. And then they tail off. There are some practices here that have over 30,000 patients. That seems they must be quite large practices, I guess. So that's giving us a sense of the kind of the distribution, what our practices might look like. We can also add another chart. We have some kind of the demographic information here, or geodemographic information to do with local authority classification. So this is something available through from the kind of the census. So if we take a look, see what this gives us. Let's have a look. So these are different categories for where the practices are: rural, urban, fringe, affluent, rural. Okay, it's a little bit difficult to make sense of that just at a glance, perhaps, and there's a lot of categories there. So we can edit this tile. And actually, I think it might make sense here to sort the categories descending. There's no natural order to these, so we can apply a sort without kind of being misleading. Let's also omit any categories that we don't have records for, omit the unclassified as well, perhaps. Let's see what we get. Okay, that looks a bit more manageable. Ethnically diverse areas, larger towns and cities, country living. Okay, that's pretty interesting. We can see the kind of the spread of where the kinds of areas that our practices are in. And there's a last thing I want to add here. Maybe we've got if we browse to it, we have a status code for our practices. Let's see how many practices fall into each type of status. And okay, so most of our practices are active, We've got some records for closed practices, dormant. I'm not quite sure what that means, but there aren't very many in that category, and some that are proposed, not yet open, I guess. So here we go. We've got the beginnings of a reasonably good dashboard here that gives us a sense of the GP practices in the UK. So I would be ready to share this with my colleagues. I guess I should give it a title, Practices Dashboard, and because Chrome is also suggesting that that title, I guess I've been practicing this presentation as well. So if we save that, we can see this is looking reasonably good. But actually, I think we can do slightly better here. So I'd like to share this to one of my colleagues, but because this is data about the NHS, it feels like it would be nice to brand it and make it look a bit more like it is from the NHS. So by kind of making it match the appropriate brand, I think that kind of gives it a bit more authority and makes it kind of feel a bit more, a bit more authentic as well. So luckily, I found that the NHS have publicly available kind of brand guidelines, identity guidelines, where they describe the colours that they would use and so on. So we can use some of this in Orbit, and we can set up an NHS brand to use here. So because I'm an administrator, I have a settings dialog here. If we go to the themes section, we get some kind of standard themes built into Orbit, but we can create a new one called NHS, and we can set some of these colors up to match the brand guidelines. So I think the main color, I would say, let's use the NHS blue. That seems a natural choice. So there we go. That's already beginning to look like what we should expect. Maybe for the labeling, let's use one of the grays that I've mentioned here, and for a highlight color, I saw this green. I think this green looks quite useful for that purpose. So already in this kind of preview sample dashboard, we can see that this is looking reasonably good. A title, I think we probably want in black, and actually it's not just black, it's NHS black. Let's use this. And maybe for the notes field, we'll use the same gray as the data label. So this is already looking quite good. We can change the font as well. Now, actually on the NHS guidelines, they don't specify a font to use. But in Orbit, we are limited to only a handful of fonts that we support, because we need to ensure that they will work across all the different browsers and devices that Orbit will run on. So we could choose to leave the default font, but potentially we could change to use Tahoma, which just sets it slightly apart, but is still quite kind of traditional maybe. So we've created our NHS theme here. We can save a draft so that we can kind of show that to our colleagues and see if they're happy that this is acceptable. And if we are happy with it, we can then publish it. One last thing I think would be useful is to be able to add a logo as well. So we can upload an NHS logo that I found here. It's a SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics, which means that the logo will look right at kind of any scaling, but you can also use standard kind of bitmap logos here. So if we go back to our theme, we can choose the logo that we've just uploaded, and it just inserts it to the left of the title there. If we publish that, and in fact, let's make that our default theme, then this will automatically be applied to our dashboard. You could choose to apply themes to one dashboard or another, but we'll just go with the default here. And so if we look back at our dashboard now, I think it's looking a lot better. It didn't look bad before, but now it definitely matches the brand. We've got the right blues. It just feels more appropriate. So we can share that with my colleague Sam, who you've already met. And let's just add a little message. Hi Sam, here is the dashboard I was going to send to you. And there we go. Sam will have got an email, and we've shared that to Sam. And actually, so we've shared that, but let's see what it looked like on the other end. Now, Sam's a great guy. I work with him closely, but sometimes he leaves his password stuck to his monitor. So we can go and quickly have a look at the world from Sam's perspective. And here we go. This is the practices dashboard that we've just created and just shared to him. And yes, there we go. It looks just as we expected. But I noticed here Sam had some other dashboards that we could look at. So maybe let's have a look at some of these as well. Okay, so this is another dashboard. It's calculating the data live from our FastStats system. So this is going to be looking at 49 million prescriptions with a total cost to the NHS of £365 million, which is quite a big number. Although I don't know if you were listening to Rishi Sunak yesterday, maybe that's not such a big number anymore. And in fact, I think if we, in all of the data that we built this FastStats system from, if we'd have included all the prescriptions here over a 2-year period, it is £16 billion worth of prescriptions prescribed by family doctors, which is a large amount of money. And the average cost of those prescriptions to the NHS, as opposed to the person actually receiving to the patient, but the average cost of the NHS is £7.43. On the right here, we have a breakdown of all the different types of medicine that make up those prescriptions. We'll come back to that in a second. And down here we have, this shows the data range in time. So from September 18 to August 2020, these are the number of prescriptions over that time, which fluctuates a little bit, but it's basically around 2 million prescriptions a month. And then the cost over that same time period as well, which is around 14, 16, maybe 17 million pounds per month for all of those prescriptions. So that kind of gives us a good sense of that data, but we can maybe have an investigation here on some of the types of medicines. So this data has a kind of a hierarchical structuring. So we've got the kind of top level view of the different types of medication, stuff for cardiovascular systems, the central nervous system, and so on and so on. Well, central nervous system, that kind of sounds important to me. We can drill into that, see what that means. Recalculates the data, and okay, so central nervous system covers antidepressants, analgesics, so kind of painkillers, anti-epileptic drugs, hypnotics, and so on. So maybe if we filter on antidepressant drugs, this top category here, what does that do to our dashboard? Okay, well, that changes things. We've applied the filter, and it's shown here on the right-hand side. So there are nearly 3.4 million prescriptions over our time period for antidepressants, with a cost to the NHS of £10 million and an average cost of just £3. So these are relatively cheap drugs. Over the prescribing period, while the number of prescriptions doesn't change very much over time, that kind of seems similar to what we saw before. But this looks a little bit interesting. Maybe the cost changes reasonably dramatically in February, between February and April. So we go from spending £362,000 up to £770,000 for broadly the same number of prescriptions. So that's an interesting result. I'm not really sure what that means, but we can maybe have a look. Google that, antidepressant price increase. Well, I've Googled this before, as you can tell. And actually there's an article on the Telegraph, UK national newspaper, that has a paywall, so we can only really see the headline. But antidepressant prices soar by 800%. The price of sertraline has risen by 823%. Well, that's interesting. So this shows that this is being written about in a national newspaper. There is something going on here, but we've not seen 800% here. We've seen maybe a doubling. Maybe we need to drill a little bit further. And okay, these are different types of antidepressants. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, I think they're called SSRIs, tricyclic antidepressants, other antidepressants. Well, let's drill into this top one again. And what have we got? Sertraline. Oh, sertraline hydrochloride and some other things as well. Although this is the one that was mentioned in the article, I think, sertraline. So if we maybe filter on that, what do we see? Okay, so there were about $750,000 prescriptions over our time period, with a cost of approaching £3 million. Average cost £3.77. Again, not a very varied amount of prescribing, but here we can see this cost is much more dramatic. The cost change, so from £52,000 a month in February up to £421,000 in April. So that is much more like our eightfold increase. Actually, I have looked into this, and the reason was that there were problems with exporting some of the kind of raw materials for this drug from China during the initial lockdown. So it was harder to get the drug, the supply of the drug was constrained, and so the cost increased quite a lot. So okay, well, that's interesting. We've seen how we can drill into some of these things. Let's maybe remove some of these filters and go back to where we started. Hopefully that's demonstrated how we can explore the data. So we're back to where we started, but it's interesting to think that some of these drugs affect the amount that's spent by the NHS more than others. So one thing that we can maybe do is add an extra thing to this dashboard, add a new tile with a Pareto. So this will allow us to kind of see, this categorical Pareto will allow us to see which kind of categories of drug have the most effect in terms of a numeric value. And I think we'll look at cost here. So if we look at our prescription data, we have some various categories of data that we were drilling through before. This BNF stands for the British National Formulary, which is a standard way of categorizing drugs. And so if we look at the BNF section, let's look, we want to look at the cost. Actually, let's look at the actual cost. And so this is our type by cost Pareto. Let's see what information we get. So we can make that chart a little bit bigger as it calculates. Let's resize that. So, oh, right, okay. Well, we can see a result here, but there's an awful lot of data. It's too hard to read these labels. There's too much going on here, really. So I think we need to change this a little bit. We can edit it again. And actually, this was something that James demonstrated yesterday. The category display allows us to limit the amount of data shown. So maybe let's just look at the top 50 results. We can allow the end user to adjust that as well if we want. So maybe this will look a little bit more palatable. It goes and recalculates that data. Hopefully we'll be able to see something a bit more digestible. There we go. That's looking much more sensible. So we can save that dashboard so that we've got the dashboard now that we can interact with it. As we just calculate the data again. Here we are. We've got these kind of the different drug types ordered by kind of cost from the most expensive down. So this most expensive one, drugs used in diabetes, and then we've got anticoagulants, which I think are kind of blood thinners, corticosteroids or corticosteroids, a type of steroid, analgesics, so again kind of painkiller, pain relief drugs, and oral nutrition. I mean, on the one hand, oral nutrition sounds like food to me. I'm not a medical expert. I don't really know very much about this stuff, but I think in this case, those kinds of drugs are kind of like dietary supplements and things like that. So maybe if we pick the top 5, if we select these top 5 categories, we can see on the Pareto chart here that it's only 2% of categories. The top 5 is 2% of all of our categories. They account for about 15% of our prescriptions, but actually the cost to the NHS is more like 35%. So these types of drugs have a big impact on the NHS budget. So if we add that to the filter, so now we're filtering the rest of our dashboard by those highlighted drug types. If we go back up to the top, we can see, okay, well, those types of drugs, we've got approaching 7.5 million prescriptions for those over our 2-year period. They cost about £130 million. And our average prescription cost is much higher than we were seeing before, which makes sense. We've picked the drugs that a lot of money is spent on. So that's £17.66. These are the drug types. And but actually the amounts prescribed and the cost, there's maybe a bit of a blip in the spring, but not a dramatic amount. But again, hopefully that's demonstrated how Pareto can usefully find some interesting data here. Well, I think we should move on and look at the last dashboard. I noticed we had another dashboard here that was available about GPs. So these are the family doctors working in their practices. This dashboard has a notes tile, which I've not demonstrated before, but just a tile that you can put text in to explain what's going on here. We've got 53,000 GPs and an average tenure, so how long they've been at their most recent surgery, of around 9 years. Here is a map again showing where the GPs are spread around the country, and it seems like we've got a bit of a hotspot in the northeast of England, 1,300 GPs there, lots of GPs in the Birmingham post area and also in Oxford as well. But so there must be kind of a bit greater density of GPs there. We've also got a chart showing when they joined their current surgery. There's some, this may highlight a data issue, but there are some GPs that joined when the earliest date in 1974. And then, I suppose, as you would expect, as we get closer to the present day, more and more GPs are kind of joining their current surgery. And maybe I should say, I'm not sure that I did mention, forgive me if I did before, but all of this data is publicly available data made available by the NHS and by the government, by the UK government. So none of this data has kind of is private or has kind of restricted information in it. And there are some references in the slides, which hopefully we'll make available after the event to show you where we got this data from. Okay, so this is some information about our GPs, and then we can go down and see some different charts here. So actually, this chart on the right-hand side, this radar chart, is showing the number of GPs by the type of practice, the setting. And this radar chart, this is something that is available in the software today, but was only released a few weeks ago. So it's relatively new. We can see here that for a standard GP practice, the kind of the tenure is about the average that we see, but perhaps for this WIC and OOH practices, and yesterday I learned that WIC is walk-in centre and OOH is out of hours practice, then actually the tenure, the time that GPs have been working in that practice is less. It's also less for optometry, prisons, and so on. So okay, that's interesting to see that it does vary. Maybe optometry in prisons, it's a harder job to do, or it's people move through those practices as a stepping stone to something else. I don't know. On the left hand side here we have a multi-dimensional chart. So this actually isn't in the software today. This is a bit of a preview, and also the charts below are a preview as well. We're hoping to be able to make these available quite soon, but I thought it'd be interesting to show you them while we have everyone here. So this is showing the regions that the NHS describe in the data, and then the type of practice setting as well. So in each region, most of the practices are these standard GP practices. But we have some here. This purple one is community health services. There are plenty of those. Blue is other types of practices. and then some of these smaller ones, hospital services and so on. So this breaks down each region by the type of practice. And then down here we have two single dimension but multi-measure charts. So here the data is showing an index of multiple deprivation. So again, this is data available from the government, where it's a banding of how deprived an area the patients live in, based on number 1 is the most deprived to number 10 is the least deprived. And the data I'm showing here is the bars are the total number of patients that live in each of these deprivation deciles, and then the line is the number of patients aged 0 to 14, so the number of children. And actually those two kind of data sets follow each other pretty closely, so the number of children kind of matches the total number of patients pretty closely. This chart below, the bottom chart, is the same data except that the line is the number of patients aged 75 to 89, so older patients. And this shows a slightly different trend, where it's a little bit flatter. It doesn't follow the total number of patients line quite as closely. Now, I don't know, this would need more investigation, but I wonder if this is demonstrating that potentially in the more deprived areas, in these deciles here, perhaps the life expectancy number is a little bit lower and there are less patients at these older age bands. Don't know, we would have to investigate, but that's something to think about, and allows us to see these multi-measure and multi-dimension charts. So we can select on these. Maybe we can target some GPs. Maybe we want to target for marketing some GPs that have only started at their current practice in the last 5 years. So as we filter, we can have a look, see what happens. Well, so there does seem to be a bit of a hotspot in Oxford, less so in the northeast of England now. That's interesting. Well, maybe let's have a look at the Midlands. I'm not sure if this includes Oxfordshire or not. Let's have a see. Maybe not quite, but we can see we've identified 2,964 GPs that started in their practice in the last 5 years in the Midlands of England. We can see some of this other data as well, but let's maybe identify these people and let's take them on a little bit more. So we can create an orbit audience from this filter, from these people. So it's simple as giving it a name. So these are GPs joined in last 5 years in Midlands. And if we go and have a look at that audience, so this is orbit audiences. We won't spend very long here, but just to show you, we've got the same number of GPs that we identified before. This is the rule that we saw before, with the join date, the region, and actually we picked for the type of GP practice from our multi-dimensional chart. Now, potentially we could exclude some records here as well if we wanted to. So I think there is a flag on the GP records amended. So maybe there's some of these records have got data quality issues. So we could perhaps exclude those records that have been amended. So there's 2,500 GP records overall that have been amended. But that has, if we look our include rule, pick these 2,900 odd. But now with the excludes, we've only got 2,785. So we've lost a couple of hundred GPs there. That's okay. We're still happy with that. We can maybe have a look at the check panel in audiences. It just allows us to kind of eyeball the data a little bit. This is what we wanted. These are, okay, we've mainly got active GPs, some dormant across different of these classifications. And yes, we're still looking at Midlands GPs. We've not made a mistake. That's looking reasonably good. So we can move on to the export step. And this we can then get at that data to market to these GPs. Now, traditionally in Orbit, you could generate a CSV file or maybe an Excel file or something, and either download that data directly to manipulate or to FTP it. But again, something that isn't in the software today, but we're working on, we can also kind of integrate that directly into an ESP using the kind of PeopleStage backend that we have. So we can directly email to these people. We can choose the creative content that we want, and we can build a campaign that will run using the PeopleStage mechanism in the back end. So this is work in progress at the moment, but we can press this button and this will create a campaign in PeopleStage. There we go, it's been published successfully. Now we want to build then information into Orbit to show how that campaign is going, but we haven't got that quite yet, so we can flick to PeopleStage to see how that campaign is progressing. I just need to refresh PeopleStage to see our newly created campaign. Here it is. And if we zoom into here, so the campaign hasn't started running yet. PeopleStage checks to see if the campaign runs, if there are any new campaigns to run, about once a minute, and it's just not got around to doing that check yet. But in a second, PeopleStage will run and pick up that campaign. Oh, there we go, it's just started. That was convenient. So we'll maybe come back to that and see how that gets on. But we can also, if I can see it, go to FastStats, and we can also see Orbit audiences in FastStats. We just refresh in FastStats for a little while now. Has had an Orbit Explorer, so we can see the audience that we created in terms of a FastStats selection. So we can kind of copy it out of audiences into FastStats. We can run that, and these are our 2,785 GPs that we identified earlier. So then this can be taken on and do, this is now a selection in FastStats. You can do all of the things that you could normally expect to do in FastStats as well. Maybe let's just flick back to PeopleStage, and while we were talking, that campaign has successfully run through, and we've marketed to those GPs. So I think that's been a success. I hope we've taken you all the way through Orbit. So if I go back to PowerPoint, what did we see? Well, I hope what we saw was that we created a dashboard and added some tiles. We created and then applied an NHS theme. We've done some drilling and filtering on dashboards. We saw some simple charts and also the more powerful Pareto charts. We've got a sneak peek at some of the new charting that's coming very soon in Orbit. And we also created an audience and then showed how that can integrate with both FastStats and PeopleStage in the Apteco Marketing Suite. And one final thing before we see if we have any time for questions, or maybe we don't have time for questions, but just to say, there is a usability, a user research program that we operate. If you are interested, please get in touch at usability@apteco.com with your name and your job title and the software that you use, and we really value your feedback. So I think we perhaps don't have any time for questions. I'm afraid we will try and answer them as best we can afterwards. But I think that's everything. Do we have anything else, Sam? Have I covered it all?
I think that's everything, Adam, and thank you very much. I'm afraid, yes, we do not have any time left for questions because we started a little bit late. Everyone who didn't get their question answered in chat, but especially thank you, Pete, by the way, for answering so many questions in chat during that talk. Anyone who didn't get their question answered, you can ask it to the platform and we'll make sure we get back with a full and proper answer to you. For everyone else, if you have a moment you'd like to close the Zoom call and go back over to the platform, thank you very, very much for coming to this focus group, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.